Chapter 5, The Stages of Life. To discuss the problems connected with the stages of human development is an exacting task, for it means nothing less than unfolding a picture of psychic life in its entirety from the cradle to the grave. Within the narrow frame of this essay, the task can be carried out only on the broadest lines, and it must be well understood that no attempt will be made to describe the normal psychic occurrences within the various stages. We shall rather restrict ourselves and deal only with certain problems, that is, with things that are difficult, questionable, or ambiguous. In a word, with questions which allow of more than one answer, and, moreover, answers that are always open to doubt. For this reason, there will be much to which we must add a question mark in our thoughts, and, worse still, there will be some things which we must accept on faith, while now and then we must even indulge in speculations. If psychic life consisted only of overt happenings, which on a primitive level is still the case, we could content ourselves with a sturdy empiricism. The psychic life of civilized man, however, is full of problems. We cannot even think of it except in terms of problems. Our psychic processes are made up to a large extent of reflections, doubts, and experiments, all of which are almost completely foreign to the unconscious instinctive mind of primitive man. It is the growth of consciousness which we must thank for the existence of problems. They are the dubious gift of civilization. It is just man's turning away from instinct, his opposing himself to instinct, that creates consciousness. Instinct is nature and seeks to perpetuate nature, while consciousness can only seek culture or its denial. Even when we turn back to nature, inspired by a Rousseau-esque longing, we cultivate nature. As long as we are still submerged in nature, we are unconscious, and we live in the security of instinct that knows no problems. Everything in us that still belongs to nature shrinks away from a problem, for its name is doubt, and wherever doubt holds sway, there is uncertainty and the possibility of divergent ways. And where several ways seem possible, there we have turned away from the certain guidance of instinct and are handed over to fear. For consciousness is now called upon to do that which nature has always done for her children, namely, to give a certain, unquestionable, and unequivocal decision. And here we are beset by an all too human fear that consciousness, our Promethean conquest, may in the end not be able to serve us in the place of nature. Problems thus draw us into an orphaned and isolated state, where we are abandoned by nature and are driven to consciousness. There is no other way open to us. We are forced to resort to decisions and solutions where we formerly trusted ourselves to natural happenings. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of a widening of consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. This necessity is a psychic fact of such importance that it constitutes one of the essential symbolic teachings of the Christian religion. It is the sacrifice of the merely natural man, of the unconscious, ingenuous being whose tragic career began with the eating of the apple in paradise. The biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse, and as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further from the paradise of unconscious childhood. Every one of us gladly turns away from his problems. If possible, they must not be mentioned, or better still, their existence is denied. We wish to make our lives simple, certain, and smooth, and for that reason problems are taboo. We choose to have certainties and no doubts, results and no experiments, without even seeing that certainties can arise only through doubt, and results through experiment. The artful denial of a problem will not produce conviction. On the contrary, a wider and higher consciousness is called for to give us the certainty and clarity we need. This introduction, long as it is, seemed to me necessary in order to make clear the nature of our subject. when we must deal with problems, we instinctively refuse to try the way that leads through darkness and obscurity. We wish to hear only of unequivocal results, and completely forget that these results can only be brought about when we have ventured into and emerged again from the darkness. But to penetrate the darkness, we must summon all the powers of enlightenment that consciousness can offer. As I have already said, we must indulge in speculations, for in treating of the problems of psychic life, we perpetually stumble over questions of principle belonging to the private domains of the most different branches of knowledge. We disturb and anger the theologian no less than the philosopher, the physician no less than the educator. We even grope about in the field of the biologist and of the historian. This extravagant behavior is not to be charged to our arrogance, but to the circumstance that man's psyche is a unique combination of factors, which also make up the special subjects of far-reaching lines of research. For it is out of himself and out of his peculiar constitution that man produced his sciences. They are symptoms of his psyche. If, therefore, we ask ourselves the unavoidable question, why does man, in obvious contrast to the animal world, have problems? We run into that inextricable tangle of thoughts which many thousands of incisive minds have brought about in the course of centuries. I shall not perform the labors of a Sisyphus upon this masterpiece of confusion, but will try to present quite simply my contribution toward man's attempt to answer this basic question. There are no problems without consciousness. We must therefore put the question in another way. In what way does consciousness arise? Nobody can say with certainty, but we can observe small children in the process of becoming conscious. Every parent can see it, if he pays attention, and this is what we are able to observe. When the child recognizes someone or something, when he knows a person or a thing, then we feel that the child has consciousness. That, no doubt, is also why in paradise it was the tree of knowledge which bore such fateful fruit. But what is recognition or knowledge in this sense? We speak of knowing something when we succeed in linking a new perception to an already established context, in such a way that we hold in consciousness not only the new perception, but this context as well. Knowing is based, therefore, upon a conscious connection between psychic contents. We cannot have knowledge of disconnected contents, and we cannot even be conscious of them. The first stage of consciousness, then, which we can observe, consists in a mere connection between two or more psychic contents. At this level, consciousness is merely sporadic, being limited to the representation of a few connections, and the content is not remembered later on. It is a fact that in the early years of life there is no continuous memory. At the most, there are islands of consciousness, which are like single lamps or lighted objects in the far-flung darkness. But these islands of memory are not the same as those initial connections between psychic contents. They contain something more and something new. This something is that highly important series of related contents which constitutes the so-called ego. The ego, quite like the initial content series, is an object in consciousness, and for this reason the child speaks of itself, at first objectively, in the third person. Only later, when the ego contents have been charged with the energy of their own, very likely as a result of exercise, does the feeling of subjectivity or I-ness arise. This is, no doubt, the moment when the child begins to speak of itself in the first person. At this level, the continuity of memory has its beginning. Essentially, therefore, it is a continuity in the ego memories. In the childish stage of consciousness, there are as yet no problems. Nothing depends on the subject, for the child itself is still wholly dependent upon its parents. It is as though it were not yet completely born, but were still enclosed in the psychic atmosphere of its parents. Psychic birth, and with it the conscious distinction of the ego from the parents, takes place in the normal course of things at the age of puberty with the eruption of sexual life. The physiological change is attended by a psychic revolution. For the various bodily manifestations give such an emphasis to the ego that it often asserts itself without stint or measure. This is sometimes called the unbearable age. Until this period is reached, the psychic life of the individual is essentially governed by impulse, and few or no problems are met with. Even when external limitations oppose the subjective impulses, these restraints do not put the individual at variance with himself. He submits to them or circumvents them, remaining quite at one with himself. He does not yet know the state of inner tension which a problem brings about. This state only arises when what was an external limitation becomes an inner obstacle, when one impulse opposes itself to another. Resorting to psychological terms, we would say, the state induced by a problem, the state of being at variance with oneself, arises when, side by side with a series of ego content, a second series of equal intensity comes into being. This second series, because of its energy value, has a functional significance equal to that of the ego complex. We might call it another second ego, which in a given case can wrest the leadership from the first. This brings about an estrangement from oneself, the state that betokens a problem. With reference to what was said above, we can epitomize as follows. The first stage of consciousness, which consists of recognizing or knowing, is an anarchic or chaotic state. The second, that of the developed ego complex, is a monarchic or monistic phase. The third is another step forward in consciousness and consists in the awareness of one's divided state. It is a dualistic phase. And here we take up our actual theme, namely the question of the stages of life. First of all, we must deal with the period of youth. It extends roughly from the years just after puberty to middle life, which itself begins between the 35th and 40th year. I might well be asked why I choose to begin with the second period of human existence. Are there no difficult questions connected with childhood? The complex psychic life of the child is of course a problem of the first magnitude to parents, educators, and physicians. But when normal, the child has no real problems of its own. It is only when a human being has grown up that he can have doubts about himself and be at variance with himself. We are all thoroughly familiar with the sources of the problems which arise in the period of youth. For most people, it is the demands of life which harshly put an end to the dream of childhood. If the individual is sufficiently well prepared, the transition to a professional career may take place smoothly. But if he clings to illusions that contradict reality, then problems will surely arise. No one takes the step into life without making certain presuppositions, and occasionally they are false. That is, they may not fit the conditions into which one is thrown. It is often a question of exaggerated expectations, of underestimation of difficulties, of unjustified optimism, or of a negative attitude. One could compile quite a list of the false presuppositions which give rise to the earliest conscious problems. But it is not always the contrast of subjective presuppositions with external facts that gives rise to problems. It may as often be inner psychic disturbances. They may even exist even when things run smoothly enough in the outer world. Very often, it is the disturbance of the psychic equilibrium by the sexual impulse, and perhaps just as often it is the feeling of inferiority which springs from an unbearable sensitivity. These inner difficulties may exist even when adaptation to the outer world has been achieved without apparent effort. It even seems as if young people who have had to struggle hard for their existence are spared inner problems, while those for whom adaptation for some reason or other is made easy run into problems of sex or conflicts growing from the sense of inferiority. People whose own temperaments offer problems are often neurotic, but it would be a serious misunderstanding to confuse the existence of problems with neurosis. There is a marked distinction between the two in that the neurotic is ill because he is unconscious of his problems, while the man with a difficult temperament suffers from his own conscious problems without being ill. If we try to extract the common and essential factors from the almost inexhaustible variety of individual problems found in the period of youth, we meet in nearly all cases with a particular feature, a more or less patent clinging to the childhood level of consciousness, a rebellion against the fateful forces in and around us which tend to involve us in the world. Something in us wishes to remain a child, to be unconscious or at most conscious only of the ego, to reject everything foreign or at least subject it to our will, to do nothing or in any case indulge our own craving for pleasure or power. In this leaning we observe something like the inertia of matter. It is persistence in a hitherto existing state whose level of consciousness is smaller, narrower, and more egoistic than that of the dualistic stage. For in the latter, the individual finds himself compelled to recognize and to accept what is different and strange as a part of his own life, as a kind of also I. It is the extension of the horizon of life which is the essential feature of the dualistic stage, and to which resistance is offered. To be sure, this enlargement, or this diastole, to use Goethe's expression, had started long before this. It begins at birth, when the child abandons the narrow confinement of the mother's womb, and from then on it gains steadily until it reaches a critical point in that phase when, beset by problems, the individual begins to struggle against it. What would happen to him if he simply changed himself into that other foreign also I, and allowed the earlier ego to vanish into the past? We might suppose this to be a quite practicable course, the very aim of religious education, from the exhortation to put off the old Adam, backward in time to the rebirth rituals of primitive races, is to transform a human being into a new, a future man, and to allow the old forms of life to die away. Psychology teaches us that, in a certain sense, there is nothing in the psyche that is old, nothing that can really, definitively die away. Even Paul was left with a sting in his flesh. Whoever protects himself against what is new and strange, and thereby regresses to the past, falls into the same neurotic condition as the man who identifies himself with the new and runs away from the past. The only difference is that the one has estranged himself from the past, and the other from the future. In principle, both are doing the same thing. They are salvaging a narrow state of consciousness. The alternative is to shatter it with the tension inherent in the play of opposites, in the dualistic stage, and thereby to build up a state of wider and higher consciousness. This outcome would be ideal if it could be brought about in the second stage of life. But here is the rub. For one thing, nature cares nothing whatsoever about a higher level of consciousness. Quite the contrary. And then society does not value these feats of the psyche very highly. Its prizes are always given for achievement and not for personality, the latter being rewarded for the most part posthumously. This being so, a particular solution of the difficulty becomes compulsive. We are forced to limit ourselves to the attainable and to differentiate particular aptitudes, for in this way the capable individual discovers his social being. Achievement, usefulness, and so forth are the ideals which appear to guide us out of the confusion of crowding problems. They may be our lodestars in the adventure of extending and solidifying our psychic existences. They may help us in striking our roots in the world. But they cannot guide us in the development of that wider consciousness to which we give the name of culture. In the period of youth, at any rate, this course is the normal one, and in all circumstances preferable to merely tossing about in the welter of problems. The dilemma is often solved, therefore, in this way. Whatever is given to us by the past is adapted to the possibilities and the demands of the future. We limit ourselves to the attainable, and this means the renunciation of all other potentialities. One man loses a valuable piece of his past, another a valuable piece of his future. Everyone can call to mind friends or schoolmates who were promising and idealistic youngsters, but who, when met with years later, seemed to have grown dry and cramped in a narrow mold. These are examples of the solution given above. The serious problems of life, however, are never fully solved. If it should for once appear that they are, this is the sign that something has been lost. The meaning and design of a problem seem not to lie in its solution, but in our working at it incessantly. This alone preserves us from stultification and petrifaction. So also with that solution of the problems of the period of youth, which consists in restricting ourselves to the attainable. It is only temporarily valid and not lasting in a deeper sense. Of course, to win for oneself a place in society, and so to transform one's nature, that it is more or less fitted to this existence, is in every instance an important achievement. It is a fight waged within oneself as well as outside, comparable to the struggle of the child to defend his ego. This struggle, we must grant, is for the most part unobserved because it happens in the dark. But when we see how stubbornly childish illusions, presuppositions, and egoistic habits are still clung to in later years, we are able to realize the energy it took to form them. And so it is also with the ideals, convictions, guiding ideas, and attitudes which in the period of youth lead us out into life, for which we struggle, suffer, and win victories. They grow together with our own beings. We apparently change into them, and we therefore perpetuate them at pleasure and as a matter of course, just as the child asserts its ego in the face of the world and in spite of itself, occasionally even to spite itself. The nearer we approach to the middle of life, and the better we have succeeded in entrenching ourselves in our personal standpoints and social positions, the more it appears as if we had discovered the right course and the right ideals and principles of behavior. For this reason, we suppose them to be eternally valid, and make a virtue of unchangeably clinging to them. We wholly overlook the essential fact that the achievements which society rewards are won at the cost of a diminution of personality. Many, far too many, aspects of life which should also have been experienced lie in the lumber room among dusty memories. Sometimes even, they are glowing coals under gray ashes. Statistical tables show a rise in the frequency of cases of mental depression in men about 40. In women, the neurotic difficulties generally begin somewhat earlier. We see that in this phase of life, between 35 and 40, a significant change in the human psyche is in preparation. At first, it is not a conscious and striking change. It is rather a matter of indirect signs of a change which seems to take its rise from the unconscious. Often, it is something like a slow change in a person's character. In another case, certain traits may come to light which had disappeared in childhood. Or again, inclinations and interests begin to weaken and others arise to take their places. It also frequently happens that the convictions and principles which have hitherto been accepted, especially the moral principles, commence to harden and to grow increasingly rigid until, somewhere towards the age of 50, a period of intolerance and fanaticism is reached. It is then as if the existence of these principles were endangered, and it were therefore necessary to emphasize them all the more. The wine of youth does not always clear with advancing years. Oftentimes it grows turbid. All the manifestations mentioned above can be most clearly seen in rather one-sided people, turning up sometimes sooner and sometimes later. In my opinion, their appearance is often delayed by the fact that a person's parents are still alive. It is then as if the period of youth were unduly continued. I have seen this especially in the cases of men whose fathers were long-lived. The death of the father then has the effect of an over-hurried and almost catastrophic ripening. I know of a pious man who was a church warden and who, from the age of 40 onward, showed a growing and finally unbearable intolerance in things of morality and religion. At the same time, his disposition grew visibly worse. At last, he was nothing more than a darkly lowering pillar of the church. In this way, he got along until his 55th year, when suddenly one night, sitting up in bed, he said to his wife, "Now at last I've got it. As a matter of fact, I'm just a plain rascal." Nor did this self-realization remain without results. He spent his declining years in riotous living and in wasting a goodly part of his fortune. Obviously, quite a likable person capable of both extremes. The very frequent neurotic disturbances of adult years have this in common, that they betray the attempt to carry the psychic dispositions of youth beyond the threshold of the so-called years of discretion. Who does not know those touching old gentlemen who must always warm up the dish of their student days, who can fan the flames of life only by reminiscences of their heroic youth, and who, for the rest, are stuck in a hopelessly wooden Philistinism? As a rule, to be sure, they have this one merit which it would be wrong to undervalue. They are not neurotic, but only boring or stereotyped. The neurotic is rather a person who can never have things as he would like them in the present, and who can therefore never enjoy the past. As formerly, the neurotic could not escape from childhood, so now he cannot part with his youth. He shrinks from the gray thoughts of approaching age, and, feeling the prospect before him unbearable, is always straining to look behind him. Just as a childish person shrinks back from the unknown in the world and in human existence, so the grown man shrinks back from the second half of life. It is as if unknown and dangerous tasks were expected of him, or as if he were threatened with sacrifices and losses which he does not wish to accept, or as if his life up to now seemed to him so fair and so precious that he could not do without it. Is it perhaps at bottom the fear of death? That does not seem to me very probable, because as a rule, death is still far in the distance, and is therefore regarded somewhat in the light of an abstraction. Experience shows us rather that the basis and cause of all the difficulties of this transition are to be found in a deep-seated and peculiar change within the psyche. In order to characterize it, I must take for comparison the daily course of the sun, but a sun that is endowed with human feeling and man's limited consciousness. In the morning it arises from the nocturnal sea of unconsciousness and looks upon the wide, bright world which lies before it, in an expanse that steadily widens the higher it climbs in the firmament. In this extension of its field of action, caused by its own rising, the sun will discover its significance. It will see the attainment of the greatest possible height, the widest possible dissemination of its blessings, as its goal. In this conviction, the sun pursues its unforeseen course to the zenith, unforeseen because its career is unique and individual, and its culminating point could not be calculated in advance. At the stroke of noon the descent begins, and the descent means the reversal of all the ideals and values that were cherished in the morning. The sun falls into contradiction with itself. It is as though it should draw in its rays instead of emitting them. Light and warmth decline and are at last extinguished. All comparisons are lame, but this simile is at least not lamer than others. A French aphorism sums it up with cynical resignation: if youth only knew, if age only could. Fortunately, we men are not rising and setting suns, for then it would fare badly with our cultural values. But there is something sun-like within us, and to speak of the morning and spring, of the evening and autumn of life, is not mere sentimental jargon. We thus give expression to a psychological truth, even more, to physiological facts, for the reversal at noon changes even bodily characteristics. Especially among southern races, one can observe that older women develop rough and deep voices, incipient mustaches, hard facial expressions, and other masculine traits. On the other hand, the masculine physique is toned down by feminine features, as, for instance, adiposity and softer facial expressions. There is an interesting report in ethnological literature about an Indian warrior chief to whom in middle age the Great Spirit appeared in a dream. The Spirit announced to him that from then on he must sit among the women and children, wear women's clothes, and eat the food of women. He obeyed the dream without suffering a loss of prestige. This vision is a true expression of the psychic revolution of life's noon, of the beginning of life's decline. Man's values and even his body tend to undergo a reversal into the opposite. We might compare masculinity and femininity with their psychic components to a particular store of substances of which, in the first half of life, unequal use is made. A man consumes his large supply of masculine substance and has left over only the smaller amount of feminine substance, which he must now put to use. It is the other way round with a woman. She allows her unused supply of masculinity to become active. This transformation weighs more heavily still in the psychic realm than in the physical. How often it happens that a man of 40 or 50 years winds up his business, and that his wife then dons the trousers and opens a little shop where he sometimes performs the duties of handyman. There are many women who only awake to social responsibility and to social consciousness after their 40th year. In modern business life, especially in the United States, nervous breakdown in the 40s or after is a very common occurrence. If one studies the victims a little closely, one sees that the thing which has broken down is the masculine style of life, which held the field up to now. What is left over is an effeminate man. Contrariwise, one can observe women in these self-same business spheres who have developed in the second half of life an uncommon masculinity and an incisiveness which push the feelings and the heart aside. Very often the reversal is accompanied by all sorts of catastrophes in marriage, for it is not hard to imagine what may happen when the husband discovers his tender feelings and the wife her sharpness of mind. The worst of it all is that intelligent and cultivated people have these leanings without even knowing of the possibility of such transformations. Wholly unprepared, they embark upon the second half of life. Or are there perhaps colleges for 40-year-olds which prepare them for their coming life and its demands as the ordinary colleges introduce our young people to a knowledge of the world and of life? No, there are none. Thoroughly unprepared, we take the step into the afternoon of life. Worse still, we take this step with the false presupposition that our truths and ideals will serve us as hitherto. But we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. I have given psychological treatment to too many people of advancing years, and have looked too often into the secret chambers of their souls not to be moved by this fundamental truth. Aging people should know that their lives are not mounting and unfolding, but that an inexorable inner process forces the contraction of life. For a young person, it is almost a sin, and certainly a danger, to be too much occupied with himself. But for the aging person, it is a duty and a necessity to give serious attention to himself. After having lavished its light upon the world, the sun withdraws its rays in order to illumine itself. Instead of doing likewise, many old people prefer to be hypochondriacs, niggards, doctrinaires, applauders of the past or eternal adolescence, all lamentable substitutes for the illumination of the self, but inevitable consequences of the delusion that the second half of life must be governed by the principles of the first. I said just now that we have no schools for 40-year-olds. That is not quite true. Our religions were always such schools in the past, but how many people regard them as such today? How many of us older persons have really been brought up in such a school and prepared for the second half of life, for old age, death, and eternity? A human being would certainly not grow to be 70 or 80 years old if this longevity had no meaning for the species to which he belongs. The afternoon of human life must also have a significance of its own and cannot be merely a pitiful appendage to life's morning. The significance of the morning undoubtedly lies in the development of the individual, our entrenchment in the outer world, the propagation of our kind and of the care of our children. This is the obvious purpose of nature, but when this purpose has been attained, and even more than attained, shall the earning of money, the extension of conquests, and the expansion of life go steadily on beyond the bounds of all reason and sense? Whoever carries over into the afternoon the law of the morning, that is, the aims of nature, must pay for doing so with damage to his soul, just as surely as a growing youth who tries to salvage his childish egoism must pay for this mistake with social failure. Money-making, social existence, family, and posterity are nothing but plain nature, not culture. Culture lies beyond the purpose of nature. Could by any chance culture be the meaning and purpose of the second half of life? In primitive tribes, we observe that the old people are almost always the guardians of the mysteries and the laws, and it is in these that the cultural heritage of the tribe is expressed. How does the matter stand with us? Where is the wisdom of our old people? Where are their precious secrets and their visions? For the most part, our old people try to compete with the young. In the United States, it is almost an ideal for the father to be the brother of his sons, and for the mother, if possible, to be the younger sister of her daughter. I do not know how much of this confusion comes as a reaction to an earlier exaggeration of the dignity of age, and how much is to be charged to false ideals. These undoubtedly exist, and the goal of those who hold them lies behind, and not in front. Therefore, they are always striving to turn back. We have to grant to these persons that it is hard to see what other goal the second half of life can offer than the well-known goal of the first. Expansion of life, usefulness, efficiency, the cutting of a figure in social life, the shrewd steering of offspring into suitable marriages and good positions, are not these purposes enough? Unfortunately, this is not enough meaning or purpose for many persons who see in the approach of old age a mere diminution of life, and who look upon their earlier ideals only as something faded and worn out. Of course, if these persons had filled up the beaker of life earlier and emptied it to the lees, they would feel quite differently about everything now. Had they kept nothing back, all that wanted to catch fire would have been consumed, and the quiet of old age would be very welcome to them. But we must not forget that only a very few people are artists in life, that the art of life is the most distinguished and rarest of all the arts. Whoever succeeded in draining the whole cup with grace? So for many people, all too much unlived life remains over. Sometimes potentialities which they could never have lived with the best of wills. And so they approach the threshold of old age with unsatisfied claims which inevitably turn their glances backward. It is particularly fatal for such people to look backward. For them, a prospect and a goal in the future are indispensable. This is why all great religions hold the promise of a life beyond. It makes it possible for mortal man to live the second half of life with as much perseverance and aim as the first. For the man of today, the enlargement of life and its culmination are plausible goals, but the idea of life after death seems to him questionable or beyond belief. And yet life's cessation, that is, death, can only be accepted as a goal when existence is so wretched that we are glad for it to end, or when we are convinced that the sun strives to its setting to illuminate distant races, with the same perseverance that it showed in rising to the zenith. But to believe has become today such a difficult art that people, and particularly the educated part of humanity, can hardly find their way there. They have become too accustomed to the thought that, with regard to immortality and such questions, there are many contradictory opinions and no convincing proofs. Since science has become the catchword which carries the weight of conviction in the contemporary world, we ask for scientific proofs. But educated people who can think know that proof of this kind is out of the question. We simply know nothing whatever about it. May I remark that, for the same reasons, we cannot know whether anything happens to a person after he is dead? The answer is neither yes or no. We simply have no definite scientific proofs about it one way or another, and are therefore in the same position as when we ask whether the planet Mars is inhabited or not. And the inhabitants of Mars, if there are any, are certainly not concerned whether we affirm or deny their existence. They may exist or not, and that is how it stands with so-called immortality. with which we may shelve the problem. But here my physician's conscience awakens and urges me to say a word which is essential to this question. I have observed that a directed life is in general better, richer, and healthier than an aimless one, and that it is better to go forwards with the stream of time than backwards against it. To the psychotherapist, an old man who cannot bid farewell to life appears as feeble and sickly as a young man who is unable to embrace it. And as a matter of fact, in many cases, it is a question of the self-same childish covetousness, of the same fear, the same obstinacy and willfulness, in the one as in the other. As a physician, I am convinced that it is hygienic, if I may use the word, to discover in death a goal towards which one can strive, and that shrinking away from it is something unhealthy and abnormal, which robs the second half of life of its purpose. I therefore consider the religious teaching of a life hereafter consonant with the standpoint of psychic hygiene. When I live in a house which I know will fall about my head within the next 2 weeks, all my vital functions will be impaired by this thought. But if on the contrary I feel myself to be safe, I can dwell there in a normal and comfortable way. From the standpoint of psychotherapy, it would therefore be desirable to think of death as only a transition, one part of a life process whose extent and duration escape our knowledge. In spite of the fact that by far the largest part of mankind does not know why the body needs salt, everyone demands it nonetheless because of an instinctive need. It is the same in the things of the psyche. A large majority of people have, from time immemorial, felt the need of believing in a continuance of life. The demands of therapy, therefore, do not lead us into any bypaths, but down the middle of the roadway trodden by humankind. And therefore, we are thinking correctly with respect to the meaning of life, even though we do not understand what we think. Do we ever understand what we think? We only understand that thinking, which is a mere equation, and from which nothing comes out but what we have put in. That is the working of the intellect. But beyond that, there is a thinking in primordial images, in symbols which are older than historical man, which have been ingrained in him from earliest times, and, eternally living, outlasting all generations, still make up the groundwork of the human psyche. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. Wisdom is a return to them. It is neither a question of belief nor of knowledge, but of the agreement of our thinking with the primordial images of the unconscious. They are the source of all our conscious thought, and one of these primordial thoughts is the idea of life after death. Science and these symbols are incommensurables. They are indispensable conditions of the imagination. They are primary data, the materials whose expediency and warrant to exist science cannot deny offhand. It can only treat of them as given facts, much as it can explore a function like that of the thyroid gland, for example. Before the 19th century, the thyroid was regarded as a meaningless organ, merely because it was not understood. It would be equally short-sighted of us today to call the primordial images senseless. For me, these images are something like psychic organs, and I treat them with the very greatest care. It happens sometimes that I must say to an older patient, "Your picture of God or your idea of immortality is atrophied. Consequently, your psychic metabolism is out of gear." The ancient Athanasius Pharmakon, the medicament of immortality, is more profound and meaningful than we supposed. In this place, I would like to return again for a moment to the comparison with the sun. The 180 degrees of the arc of life are divisible into 4 parts. The first quarter, lying to the east, is childhood, that state in which we are a problem for others, but are not yet conscious of any problems of our own. Conscious problems fill out the second and third quarter, while in the last, in extreme old age, we descend again into that condition where, unworried by our state of consciousness, we again become something of a problem for others. Childhood and extreme old age, to be sure, are utterly different, and yet they have one thing in common: submersion in unconscious psychic happenings. Since the mind of a child grows out of the unconscious, its psychic processes, though not easily accessible, are not as difficult to discern as those of a very old person who is plunged again into the unconscious and who progressively vanishes within it